The lawyer's words kept echoing in my head as I drove through the winding roads of rural Montana. Your great-uncle Mortimer left you 900 acres of prime land near Whitefish. I'm Yates Callahan, a 32-year-old carpenter from Portland, Oregon. And until 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know I had a great-uncle Mortimer, let alone that he owned almost a square mile of Montana wilderness worth several $1 million. The property sat about 20 minutes outside Whitefish, a town I'd visited once as a kid for skiing. According to the documents, the land had been in our family since the 1950s, purchased for next to nothing and held onto through decades of appreciation. Mortimer had been a recluse who lived in a cabin on the far eastern edge of the property, and apparently he'd barely interacted with anyone for the last 30 years of his life. I pulled off Highway 93 onto a gravel road marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Ponderosa Heights. That was odd. The property documents made no mention of any subdivision or named development. My truck bounced along the rutted road for about a mile before I crested a hill and stopped dead. Below me, spread across what should have been pristine Montana wilderness, sat approximately 40 houses. Not cabins or rustic structures, but full-sized suburban homes with manicured lawns, paved streets, and matching mailboxes. My heart started pounding as I continued down the road, passing a playground, a small community center, and what appeared to be a man-made pond with a fountain. I parked in front of the community center and sat there, stunned. This couldn't be right. The land surveys clearly showed the property boundaries, and unless I was completely misreading the maps, all of these homes were sitting on my land. Our land. Mortimer's land. A woman in her late 40s approached my truck before I could gather my thoughts. She had that particular haircut, the one that's shorter in the back and angles down toward the front, highlighted blonde against darker roots. She wore a white visor despite the overcast sky and carried a clipboard like a weapon. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp. "This is private property. You can't just park here." I stepped out of my truck, holding the property documents. "I'm Yates Callahan. I believe I actually own this land." Her face went through several shades of red before settling on an angry crimson. "I'm Regina Whitmore, president of the Ponderosa Heights Homeowners Association, and I can assure you that you most certainly do not own this property. Each homeowner here has a deed to their land. Madam, I just inherited this property from my great-uncle Mortimer Callahan. According to these surveys and the deed, this entire development is sitting on my 900 acres. I held out the documents, but she didn't even glance at them. "That's ridiculous. We've been here for 12 years. 12 years. We bought our homes from Westmont Development Corporation. This is our community." She clutched her clipboard tighter. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call the police." "Please do," I said calmly. "I'd love to have the sheriff here to help sort this out." Her eyes narrowed, but she pulled out her phone and made the call. Within 20 minutes, a Flathead County Sheriff's deputy arrived. He was a lean man in his 50s with a patient demeanor that suggested he'd dealt with Regina before. "Afternoon, folks. I'm Deputy Harmon. What seems to be the problem?" Regina launched into a rapid-fire explanation about me trespassing and making outrageous claims. When she finally paused for breath, I handed Deputy Harmon my documents. He studied them carefully, pulling out his phone to check something, then studied them again. "Madam," he said to Regina, "these documents appear legitimate. This gentleman's great-uncle did indeed own 900 acres in this area, and according to the property description, it does seem to encompass this development." "That's impossible." Regina's voice hit a pitch that made a nearby dog start barking. "We have deeds, legal deeds." "I'm sure you do," Deputy Harmon said. But the question is whether the company that sold you those deeds actually owned the land. That's going to require lawyers and judges to sort out. In the meantime, Mr. Callahan has every right to be here, as it appears to be his property. Regina looked like she might explode. This is outrageous. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting tonight, 7 p.m. sharp at the community center. You, she jabbed a finger at me, need to be there to explain yourself. After she stormed off and Deputy Harmon left with a sympathetic pat on my shoulder, I drove around the development. The houses were nice, probably in the $300,000 to $400,000 range, which was reasonable for Montana in 2025. The streets had names like Elk Ridge Drive and Bear Meadow Lane. Everything was neat, orderly, and completely unauthorized on my land. I called my lawyer in Portland, a sharp woman named Jennifer Kowalski who'd handled the estate paperwork. She listened to my description and let out a low whistle. Yates, this is either a massive surveying error or fraud. From what you've told me, it sounds like someone sold properties they didn't actually own. I'm going to need to make some calls. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos, get copies of whatever you can. And yes, attend that HOA meeting. I'm going to reach out to a property attorney in Montana who can help us. I spent the afternoon driving the perimeter of the property, using the GPS coordinates from the survey to confirm the boundaries. There was no doubt. The entire Ponderosa Heights development, along with about 600 additional acres of undeveloped forest and meadow, belonged to me. At 7 p.m., I walked into the community center to find about 60 angry people waiting. Regina stood at the front near a podium, her clipboard ready. The moment I entered, the room fell silent. "Everyone, this is the man who's trying to steal our homes," Regina announced dramatically. "I'm not trying to steal anything," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm trying to understand how 40 houses ended up on land that my family has owned since 1952. A man in his 60s stood up. "Young man, I'm Gordon Fletcher. I paid $375,000 for my home in 2013. Are you telling me I don't own it?" "I'm saying you might own the structure but not the land it's sitting on," I replied. "I'm just as confused as you are. Who did you purchase from?" "Westmont Development Corporation," several people called out simultaneously. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search. According to the Montana Secretary of State's business database, Westmont Development Corporation dissolved in 2019. It was registered to a man named Charles Pemberton. The room erupted in chaos. People were shouting, some were crying, and Regina was banging a gavel against the podium like she was trying to break it. "Order, order," she screamed. "This is clearly a scam. This man is trying to extort us." "I'm not extorting anyone," I said loudly, waiting for the room to quiet down. "Look, I understand you're scared. If I were in your position, I'd be terrified. But the legal reality is that you're all living on my property. Now we can handle this in court, which will take years and cost everyone a fortune, or we can try to work something out. What are you proposing?" asked a younger woman holding a toddler. I hadn't actually thought that far ahead, but an idea was forming. "You're all currently occupying my land without permission and without paying for it. That's the legal reality. But I'm not interested in throwing families out of their homes. What if we formalize this arrangement? You pay me rent for the land your homes sit on, and I'll give you long-term leases with an option to purchase the land at a fair price." "Rent, rent," Regina looked apoplectic. "We already pay HOA fees, we pay property taxes, and now you want rent too." "You're paying property taxes on land you don't own," I pointed out. "And who are you paying HOA fees to?" There was an uncomfortable silence. Finally, Gordon spoke up. The HOA fees go into a community fund managed by the board. They maintain the common areas, the playground, the pond. The pond and playground that are also on my land, I said. Look, I'm not trying to be unreasonable, but you're asking me to just give up 900 acres of prime Montana property because a fraudulent developer sold you houses on it. That's not happening. A woman in her 30s stood up. How much rent are we talking about? I have no idea yet. I need to consult with attorneys and determine fair market value for land leases. But I promise you it'll be reasonable, and like I said, with an option to purchase. Regina stepped forward. This is blackmail. We'll sue you. We'll tie you up in court for decades. That's your right, I said. But I should mention that while we're in court, I'll be filing eviction proceedings and demanding back rent for the 12 years you've been here. I'll also be going after Westmont Development Corporation's assets and any individuals involved in selling property they didn't own. That's fraud and it's criminal. The room got very quiet. People looked at each other nervously. I'm going to Montana State University tomorrow to meet with a property law professor, I continued. Then I'm hiring a local attorney. I'll have a formal proposal for you within 2 weeks. In the meantime, you're not in any immediate danger of losing your homes. But we do need to resolve this legally. I left the community center feeling exhausted. The drive back to the motel in Whitefish gave me time to think. I wasn't trying to be cruel, but I also wasn't going to be a pushover. This was a complicated situation, and I needed expert guidance. The next morning, I met with Professor Linda Yazzie at the Montana State University Law School in Missoula, about 2 hours south of Whitefish. She was a property law expert who'd agreed to consult on the case after Jennifer contacted her colleague network. This is fascinating, Professor Yazzie said, spreading the documents across her desk. And horrifying for those homeowners. Here's the situation from a legal standpoint. Your great-uncle owned the land free and clear. Westmont Development Corporation apparently never purchased it from him, which means they had no right to subdivide and sell it. Every deed they issued is essentially worthless as far as the land is concerned. But the homeowners bought in good faith, I said. They had no way of knowing. Correct. They're innocent victims of fraud. However, that doesn't change the underlying property rights. You own the land. Now, Montana has some squatters' rights laws, technically called adverse possession, but they require continuous occupation for 5 years, and the occupation must be open, notorious, hostile, and under claim of right. These homeowners might try to argue adverse possession, but it's complicated because they were paying property taxes to the county based on fraudulent deeds. So what's my best move? Professor Yazzie leaned back in her chair. Honestly, what you propose to them is probably the most ethical and practical solution. Offer them long-term ground leases with options to purchase. Set the rent at something reasonable, well below market rate, to acknowledge that they're victims in this situation too. Give them 20-year leases with purchase options at, say, 10% below market value. That gives them security and a path to actual ownership. And what if they refuse? Then you go to court and you'll win. But you'll make enemies of 40 families. It'll take years, cost a fortune in legal fees. And you'll probably end up with a bunch of houses you have to demolish because the owners will have no incentive to maintain them once they know they're losing everything. It would be a Pyrrhic victory. I spent the next week working with a local attorney named Thomas Whitmore, who turned out to be Regina's ex-husband. He found the situation darkly amusing. Regina's always been about control, he said with a rueful smile. The HOA presidency is her kingdom. This is going to drive her absolutely crazy. Together, we drafted a proposal. For homes in the development, I'd charge $250 per month in ground rent, which was well below market rate. The leases would run for 20 years with automatic renewal options. At any point, homeowners could purchase their lot at 15% below appraised value. For the common areas like the playground, pond, and community center, the HOA could lease them for $1,000 per month total, with the same purchase option. "This is incredibly generous," Thomas said. "You could easily charge double or triple this." "I know," I said, "but these people are victims. I'm not interested in punishing them for someone else's fraud." The proposal went out to all homeowners, and I scheduled another community meeting. The response was mixed. Many homeowners saw it as reasonable under the circumstances. Others, led by Regina, were furious and wanted to fight. At the second meeting, Regina came armed with her own lawyer, a slick-looking man from Kalispell named Martin Hodges. He stood up and immediately went on the attack. "My clients have been conducting extensive research," Hodges began, "and we believe they have a strong case for adverse possession. They've been living here openly for 12 years, maintaining the property, paying taxes, and making improvements. Under Montana law, they may already own this land." Thomas stood up beside me. "The adverse possession statute requires 5 years, which they've exceeded, but it also requires that the possession be hostile to the true owner's interests. These homeowners paid money to Westmont Development under the belief that they were legitimate purchasers. That's not hostile possession. That's good faith purchase. Additionally, adverse possession claims fail when the true owner was unaware of the encroachment and had no reasonable way to discover it. Mr. Callahan's great-uncle was a recluse living on the far edge of a 900-acre property. He had no way of knowing that someone had fraudulently developed the western portion. "We'll let a judge decide that," Hodges shot back. "Please do," Thomas replied calmly. "In the meantime, my client is prepared to file for immediate back rent for the full 12 years of occupation, plus damages for unauthorized use of his property. At commercial rates, that would be approximately $7 million across all homeowners. He's also prepared to file criminal fraud complaints against everyone involved in Westmont Development Corporation." The room went silent. I could see the calculation happening in people's eyes. Fight and potentially lose everything, or accept a generous offer that gave them security and a path to ownership. Gordon Fletcher stood up again. "Mr. Callahan, can you guarantee that if we sign these leases, you won't sell the property to a developer or suddenly increase the rent after a few years?" "The leases are binding contracts," I said. "The rent can only increase with the Consumer Price Index, no more than 3% annually. And I'm not interested in selling to developers. I plan to keep the undeveloped portions of the property as they are." "Why should we trust you?" Regina demanded. "Because unlike Westmont Development Corporation, I actually own the land and I'm offering you legal documentation. You don't have to trust me personally. You just have to trust the contract." Over the next month, 32 of the 40 homeowners signed the lease agreements. They were relieved to have legal security, even if it meant paying rent on top of their mortgages and HOA fees. 8 homeowners, including Regina, refused and banded together to file a lawsuit claiming adverse possession. The lawsuit was filed in Flathead County District Court in March of 2025. My attorney Thomas was confident, but warned me it would take at least a year to resolve. In the meantime, I moved into Mortimer's old cabin on the eastern edge of the property. It needed work, but it had good bones and an incredible view of the mountains. Living on the property gave me a new perspective. I started to understand why Mortimer had loved it so much. There were elk herds that moved through the northern meadows, a creek that ran cold and clear through the southern portion, and stands of old-growth ponderosa pine that must have been hundreds of years old. I also got to know some of my tenants. Gordon Fletcher turned out to be a retired engineer who loved to fish. He showed me the best spots along the creek. A younger couple, Mike and Sarah Torres, had a 1-year-old daughter and were grateful for the lease because they'd been terrified of losing their home. An older widow named Dorothy Vance baked cookies and brought them to the cabin, apologizing for the whole mess even though she'd been one of the first to sign. Regina, on the other hand, made herself into my nemesis. She filed complaints with the county about everything she could think of. She claimed the cabin was a code violation. She reported me for disturbing the peace when I was cutting firewood at 10 in the morning. She sent certified letters demanding I maintain the roads to her standards and threatening additional lawsuits. Her harassment campaign hit its peak in June. I was working on renovating the cabin's kitchen when I heard trucks coming up the road. I walked out to find a convoy of vehicles headed by a large truck with Big Sky surveying on the side. Regina climbed out of her BMW, looking triumphant. I've hired independent surveyors to verify the property boundaries. When they prove that your survey is wrong, we're going to sue you for harassment and emotional distress. Go ahead, I said. I've got nothing to hide. The surveyors worked for 3 days, using GPS equipment and comparing against historical records. When they finished, the head surveyor, a weathered man named Pete, came to find me at the cabin. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Your property boundaries are exactly where you said they are. In fact, if anything, the development is about 20 feet further onto your land than your survey showed because of how they oriented the southern road." "What did Mrs. Whitmore say when you told her?" Pete shook his head. "She insisted we'd made a mistake, refused to pay our bill. Said she'd see us in court too. That evening I got a call from Thomas. 'Yates, we need to talk. I've been doing some digging into Westmont Development Corporation and Charles Pemberton. I found something interesting.' 'What's that?' Pemberton didn't act alone. He had a partner who helped sell the properties and manage the initial development. Someone who was very involved in setting up the HOA structure and making sure everything looked legitimate." "Who?" "Regina Whitmore." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. She was involved in the fraud. Up to her eyeballs. I found incorporation documents that list her as vice president of Westmont Development Corporation. She signed off on multiple deed transfers. She knew the whole time that they didn't own the land. Why would she buy a house here if she knew it was fraudulent? I don't think she paid full price, if she paid anything at all. Her deed transfer shows a purchase price of $50,000 for a house worth $350,000. I think that was her cut for helping Pemberton pull off the scam. Can we prove this? I'm working on it. I've subpoenaed bank records and corporate documents. If I can show she was an active participant in the fraud, not only does her adverse possession claim fail, but she could face criminal charges. The lawsuit hearing was scheduled for September. Thomas spent the summer building our case, and what he uncovered was stunning. Regina had been Pemberton's girlfriend in the early 2010s. Together, they'd hatched a plan to develop and sell properties on land they didn't own, figuring that by the time anyone noticed, they'd be long gone with the money. But then Pemberton had disappeared in 2018, leaving Regina holding the bag. She'd managed to avoid scrutiny by positioning herself as just another homeowner, even becoming HOA president to maintain control of the narrative and prevent anyone from digging too deeply into the development's origins. On September 15th, we all gathered in the Flathead County Courthouse. Judge Patricia Morneau presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through garbage. Thomas presented our case methodically. He showed the original property deed from 1952. He showed the continuous chain of ownership through my family. He showed that Westmont Development Corporation had never purchased, leased, or otherwise acquired legal rights to the property. He demonstrated that the homeowner's deeds, while legitimate-looking, conveyed title to land that Westmont never owned. Then he dropped the bomb about Regina. Your Honor, we have evidence that Miss Whitmore was not an innocent purchaser, but rather a co-conspirator in the fraudulent development scheme. He presented bank records showing she'd received over $400,000 from Westmont Development Corporation between 2012 and 2018. He showed her signature on corporate documents. He showed emails between her and Pemberton discussing how to market the properties and structure the sales. Regina's attorney tried to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. Judge Mortimer ordered a recess and called both attorneys into chambers. When they emerged 30 minutes later, Regina looked pale. The judge's ruling came down a week later. She found in my favor on every count. The 8 holdout homeowners did not have adverse possession claims. I was the legal owner of the land. However, she also praised my lease proposal as an equitable solution to a difficult situation created by criminal fraud, and ordered the holdout homeowners to either sign leases within 30 days or vacate the properties. But the ruling didn't stop there. Judge Mortimer referred Regina's case to the Flathead County Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. She also ordered Regina to pay back every penny she'd received from Westmont Development Corporation, plus damages to the homeowners she'd helped defraud. The 8 holdout homeowners all signed leases within a week. No one wanted to fight anymore. Regina, meanwhile, was arrested in early October and charged with fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy. The trial was scheduled for March 2026. I attended every day of Regina's trial. The prosecution laid out the whole scheme in detail. Pemberton and Regina had identified Mortimer's property as perfect for their scam because he was elderly, reclusive, and had no close family checking on things. They'd created fake documents showing Westmont had purchased the land, subdivided it, and obtained development permits, all of which were forgeries. They'd sold 40 properties over 4 years, netting nearly $12 million. Pemberton had taken about $8 million and vanished, likely to Central America. Regina had kept $4 million and tried to maintain the charade. The defense argued that Regina had been manipulated by Pemberton, that she'd believed he'd actually purchased the land. But the emails and documents told a different story. She'd known exactly what they were doing. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Mortimer sentenced Regina to 8 years in prison and ordered full restitution to the victims. Since Pemberton was in the wind, Regina was on the hook for the entire amount. Her house was seized along with all her other assets. She'd be paying off the debt for the rest of her life. As Regina was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she looked at me with pure hatred. I felt no satisfaction, just sadness that someone had been so greedy they destroyed dozens of lives and their own future. The homeowners who'd been defrauded by Regina and Pemberton had a separate civil case against them. My attorney helped them file claims against Regina's restitution fund. It wouldn't make them whole, but it was something. In the aftermath, the Ponderosa Heights community had to elect a new HOA president. Gordon Fletcher took over, and he did things differently. Instead of Regina's iron-fisted control, Gordon focused on communication and community building. He came to me in May of 2026 with an interesting proposal. Yates, the HOA has been talking. A lot of us want to buy our lots outright. We want the security of actually owning the land under our homes. Would you be willing to sell at the prices you specified in the leases? Absolutely, I said. That was always the plan. Over the next year, 38 of the 40 homeowners purchased their lots. The two who didn't were young families who couldn't afford it yet, but they were happy to continue leasing. The sales brought in over $2 million, which I used partly to fully renovate Mortimer's cabin and partly to put conservation easements on the remaining 600 acres of undeveloped land. That meant the forest and meadows would stay wild forever, protected from future development. I also used some of the money to improve the community. I funded a new playground with better equipment. I paid to stock the pond with trout so kids could fish. I even built a small workshop near the community center where I taught carpentry classes on weekends. The community transformed. Without Regina's constant drama and rules enforcement, people relaxed and got to know each other. Block parties became common. Kids played in the streets until sunset. It felt like an actual neighborhood instead of a battleground. Gordon and I became good friends. We went fishing every Sunday morning, and he taught me about the local ecosystem. His wife Martha started a community garden on a vacant lot, and I donated the seeds and materials to build raised beds. Sarah Torres, the young mom I'd met early on, came to me in tears one day in August of 2026. Yates, I need to thank you. When all this started, Mike and I thought we'd lose everything. We'd put every penny we had into this house for our daughter, but you didn't have to be kind. You could have crushed us and you had every legal right to. Instead, you gave us a way forward. You gave us hope. Those moments made everything worthwhile. I'd inherited 900 acres and found an entire community squatting on it, but instead of a nightmare, it had become an opportunity to do something good. I kept working as a carpenter, taking jobs around Whitefish and Kalispell. The rent and land sales gave me financial security, but I didn't want to stop working. I liked building things, creating with my hands. The cabin became my workshop and my home. I added a second story with huge windows facing the mountains. I built custom furniture from trees that had fallen on the property. I created a life I'd never imagined. In the fall of 2026, I was working on a deck when a car pulled up. An elderly woman got out, moving slowly with a cane. She had kind eyes and white hair pulled back in a bun. "Are you Yates Callahan?" she asked. "Yes, madam. Can I help you? I'm Eleanor Pemberton, Charles Pemberton's mother." I set down my hammer carefully. "I see. I know what my son did," she said quietly. "I know he ruined lives and stole money and ran away like a coward. I'm so ashamed I can barely look people in the eye. Mrs. Pemberton, you're not responsible for your son's choices. I know, but I want to try to make it right, at least a little bit. I have some money saved, about $100,000. I want to give it to the homeowners here to help with their expenses after everything Charles put them through." I was stunned. "Mrs. Pemberton, that's incredibly generous, but you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do. I need to do something. Please help me figure out how to distribute it fairly." We worked with Thomas to set up a fund that distributed the money to all 40 homeowners based on their financial hardship and what they'd lost in the fraud. It wasn't enough to make them whole, but it helped. Some people used it to pay off debt they'd taken on during the uncertainty. Others put it toward their lot purchases. The community threw a small dinner in Eleanor's honor. She cried through most of it as people thanked her, even though she kept insisting she didn't deserve their gratitude. But I saw what it meant to her, being able to do something positive after her son's betrayal. By the spring of 2027, 2 years after I'd first discovered Ponderosa Heights, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. I had a home I loved, a community I was part of, and work that fulfilled me. The legal battles were over. Regina was in prison. The homeowners had security and clear title to their land. I often thought about Mortimer and wondered if he'd known about the development. Thomas had found Mortimer's medical records showing he'd had severe dementia in his final years. It's possible he'd seen the construction happening in the distance, but hadn't understood what it meant or hadn't been able to do anything about it. Or maybe, given how far away the development was from his cabin, he simply never noticed. 900 acres is a lot of land. Part of me liked to think Mortimer would approve of how I'd handled things. I'd protected his land, or most of it, while also finding a way to help people who'd been victimized. I hadn't been cruel, but I hadn't been a pushover either. I'd found a middle path that honored both the legal reality and the human reality. Gordon came by the cabin one evening in June with a 6-pack of local craft beer. We sat on my deck, watching the sun set behind the mountains, turning the sky orange and purple. "You know," he said, "when you first showed up claiming to own everything, I thought you were either crazy or a con man. Regina had us all convinced we were safe, that our deeds were solid. I'm sorry you had to go through that uncertainty. Don't be." Looking back, it was the best thing that could have happened. We were living on a foundation of lies. You forced the truth into the light. Yeah, it was scary and expensive and stressful, but now we actually own our land. We have real security, not fake security built on fraud. And we got rid of Regina, which alone was worth the price of admission. We both laughed at that. Regina had made so many enemies with her petty tyranny that her downfall had been almost cathartic for the community. Plus, Gordon continued, we got you as a neighbor instead of some absentee landlord or corporate entity that doesn't give a damn about this place. You've been good for us, Yates. You've been fair and generous, and you actually care about keeping this area beautiful. It's easy to care about something this special, I said, gesturing at the view. Not everyone sees it that way. Plenty of people would have sold to the highest bidder or developed every square inch for maximum profit. You chose differently. That summer, I started dating a woman named Rachel Rosewood who worked as a veterinarian in Whitefish. We'd met when I brought in an injured fawn I'd found on the property. She was smart and funny and loved the outdoors as much as I did. She'd grown up in Montana and had that practical, no-nonsense approach to life that I appreciated. Rachel thought the whole HOA saga was hilarious. Only you could inherit 900 acres and end up being a landlord to 40 angry suburbanites, she said, laughing, when I told her the full story over dinner. It wasn't exactly what I had planned, I admitted, but you handled it well. A lot of people would have gone nuclear and made everyone's lives miserable. You found a solution. I tried. I'm not sure Regina would agree. Regina was a criminal who got what she deserved. The fact that you helped catch her is just bonus karma. By the fall of 2027, Rachel had more or less moved into the cabin. She kept her apartment in Whitefish for work but spent most nights at the property. We talked about building a bigger house, maybe on the northern section near the Elk Meadows, but there was no rush. We were happy. The Ponderosa Heights community had fully stabilized. Property values were actually going up now that people had clear title. A few homes had sold to new families who were carefully vetted by the HOA, not in the old Regina way, but just to make sure they'd fit into the community culture. Gordon instituted a rule that potential buyers had to meet with me since I still owned the community center and common areas. I didn't veto anyone, but it was nice to meet new neighbors before they moved in. One of the new families, the Kowalskis, had a son who wanted to learn carpentry. I took him on as an apprentice on weekends, teaching him the same skills my father had taught me. It felt good to pass that knowledge along. I also got involved in local politics, serving on a county advisory board about rural land use. My experience with the Westmont development fraud had given me insights into how development scams work and how to prevent them. We pushed for stronger verification requirements for property transfers and development permits. It wouldn't stop determined criminals, but it would make it harder. In the spring of 2028, I got a call from an attorney in Belize. They'd found Charles Pemberton. He'd been living under an assumed name in a beach town, running a bar with the stolen money. The Belizean authorities had arrested him on the U.S. warrant and were extraditing him back to Montana. Pemberton's trial was even quicker than Regina's had been. He tried to claim he'd believed he was buying the land legitimately, but the paper trail destroyed that defense. He'd forged documents, lied to buyers, and stolen millions. The jury convicted him on all 23 counts. Judge Morno, who'd also presided over Regina's trial, sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay back every cent he'd stolen. Between Pemberton and Regina, the homeowners eventually recovered about 60% of their losses, which was better than anyone had hoped for. With both criminals behind bars and the civil cases resolved, the whole saga finally felt truly over. The community threw a new beginning party at the community center. Everyone was invited, including Thomas, Professor Yazzie, Deputy Harmon, and even Judge Morno, who surprised everyone by showing up. "This case restored my faith in people," she said in a short speech. "Mr. Callahan had every legal right to evict all of you and demolish these homes. Instead, he chose compassion and fairness. That's rare, especially when millions of dollars are at stake. You're all lucky to have him as your neighbor." I felt embarrassed by the attention, but also proud. I had done the right thing, even when it would have been easier and more profitable to do otherwise. Rachel and I got married in the summer of 2028 in a small ceremony on the property, with the mountains as our backdrop. Gordon officiated, having gotten ordained online just for the occasion. The whole Ponderosa Heights community attended, along with my friends from Portland and Rachel's family from Missoula. Standing there with Rachel, surrounded by people I'd come to care about, on land that had passed through generations of my family to reach me, I felt overwhelmingly grateful. I'd inherited 900 acres and found an entire community squatting on it. I could have seen it as a problem, a legal nightmare, a disaster. Instead, it had become the foundation for a life I loved. We bought a house near the northern meadows and moved in the following spring. It was a beautiful custom home built by a local craftsman I'd befriended. Rachel set up her own veterinary practice in Whitefish, and I continued my carpentry work while managing the property. The Ponderosa Heights HOA continued to function, but in a healthy way now. They maintained the common areas, organized community events, and handled minor disputes. Gordon served as president for 4 years before passing the torch to Sarah Torres, whose daughter was now in elementary school and thriving in the community. I kept the old cabin as my workshop, a place to work on projects and occasionally escape to when I needed solitude. Some of Mortimer's old things were still there, including journals from his earlier years when his mind was sharp. Reading them, I learned that he'd loved the land fiercely, had seen it as a sacred trust to preserve for future generations. I like to think I was honoring that trust. 600 acres remained wild and protected. The development area was stable and properly managed. The land was generating enough income through the community center lease, and the few remaining ground rents that I could afford to maintain it without further development. In the fall of 2029, Rachel and I welcomed our daughter, Iris. We brought her home to the house near the Elk Meadows, and I felt the weight of continuing the family legacy. This land would be hers someday, and hopefully, she'd love it as much as Mortimer and I had. The Ponderosa Heights community embraced Iris. Dorothy Vance knitted tiny sweaters. Sarah Torres brought over all her daughters' outgrown baby clothes. Gordon built a custom cradle in his workshop. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were family, in all the ways that mattered. I often thought about that first day when I'd driven over the hill and seen the development spread across what should have been empty land. The shock and confusion, Regina's angry confrontation, the months of legal battles and uncertainty. It had all led here to a life I wouldn't trade for anything. The rent I'd started charging had been a pragmatic solution to a complex problem, but it had evolved into something more. It had forced everyone to acknowledge reality, to put relationships on honest foundations, and ultimately to build something real and lasting. Regina wrote me a letter from prison in 2030. It was short and bitter, blaming me for ruining her life. I didn't respond. She'd ruined her own life through greed and fraud. I'd just been the person who'd shone a light on what she'd done. Thomas told me she'd be eligible for parole in 2032, but probably wouldn't get it because she refused to show any remorse. Pemberton, meanwhile, was trying to get his sentence reduced by cooperating with federal investigators looking into other development fraud schemes. Apparently, he and Regina's scam hadn't been there first. They'd run similar cons in Wyoming and Idaho before hitting Montana. His testimony was helping build cases against other criminals, which was at least some small positive outcome from his crimes. By 2031, 6 years after I'd first discovered Ponderosa Heights, my life bore no resemblance to what I'd imagined when I got that call from the lawyer about inheriting property. I thought I'd just sell the land and use the money to expand my carpentry business in Portland. Instead, I'd moved to Montana, become a landlord, caught 2 criminals, built a community and found a family. The 900 acres had become more than just property. It was home, heritage, and hope for the future. The houses of Ponderosa Heights were no longer squatters on my land. They were my neighbors, my friends, my community. We'd been through fire together and come out stronger. Rachel and I often took Iris on walks through the elk meadows, showing her the mountains and forests that would be part of her inheritance someday. I told her stories about Mortimer, about the legal battles, about how sometimes doing the right thing is complicated and costly, but worth it. Gordon retired from the HOA presidency, but remained active in the community. He and Martha became Iris's adopted grandparents, always available to babysit or share their wisdom. Thomas closed his practice and moved to Florida, but we stayed in touch. Professor Yazzie published a paper about the case in a law journal, using it as a teaching example of property rights versus equitable solutions. The community center became a hub for the area, hosting everything from yoga classes to town halls about county issues. I kept the lease payment at $1,000 a month, even though I could have charged much more. It wasn't about maximizing profit. It was about maintaining something good. One evening in late summer of 2031, I sat on the porch of our house with Rachel, watching the sun set as elk grazed in the meadow below. Iris was asleep inside, and the world felt peaceful. "You ever regret not just selling everything when you first inherited it?" Rachel asked. I thought about it for a moment. No, never. This was so much better than money in the bank. We built something real here. You built something real. You took a disaster and turned it into a community. I had a lot of help, and I made plenty of mistakes along the way. But you stuck with it. You didn't take the easy way out. She was right. The easy way would have been to hire a ruthless attorney, evict everyone, demolish the houses, and sell the land to the highest bidder, I'd have walked away with several $1,000,000 and no complications. But I wouldn't have had this life, this community, this sense of purpose. The HOA that had started as a fraudulent fiction had become a real organization serving a real purpose. The rent I'd charged had transformed into a symbol of honest dealing and fair compromise. The land Mortimer had protected for decades would continue to be protected, now by my family and the community we'd built together. As fall turned to winter and then to spring again, life continued its rhythm. I built furniture, managed the property, raised my daughter, and loved my wife. The people of Ponderosa Heights lived their lives, secure in their homes on land they now actually owned. The elk kept their migration patterns, the creek kept flowing clear and cold, and the mountains stood eternal and beautiful. I inherited 900 acres and found an HOA squatting on it. I started charging them rent, but what I really did was build a foundation for justice, community, and hope. The money was never the point. The land was never just an asset. It was a trust, a responsibility, and ultimately, a gift that kept giving in ways I never could have imagined.